Deep in the dark of space, countless stars shone like scattered gems. Among these twinkling lights, many worlds spun in silence, each with its own story. On one such journey, a brave human named Captain Elias Drake sailed the endless void. As a skilled pilot and a kind diplomat, Drake had earned a strong reputation among the stars. His ship, the Star Wanderer, was more than metal and fuel. It was a symbol of hope for a future where all beings could share ideas and dreams. Captain Drake loved the freedom of space. He marveled at the beauty of distant galaxies and the mystery of unknown worlds. Even though humanity was small in number, its heart beat with courage and compassion. Drake believed that every life was precious and that every culture had wisdom to offer. He had traveled many light years, meeting a variety of creatures and learning about their ways. Yet, one world was about to change everything he knew. That world was Atravan, a planet known for its vibrant skies and unusual lands. Unlike Earth's open spirit, Atravan was ruled by ancient traditions and strict rules. The powerful King Zorvan held the kingdom in his iron grip, valuing order above all else. In his grand palace, every day followed the same old customs, leaving little room for new ideas or freedom. Within these walls lived Princess Larissa, the king's only daughter. Though she enjoyed the comforts of royal life, Larissa felt trapped by the heavy chains of old laws and strict expectations. Princess Larissa had a gentle soul and a curious mind. Each day, she would gaze out of the palace windows, dreaming of a life filled with choices of her own. The vast universe outside called to her, whispering promises of freedom and adventure. However, on Atravan, change was a distant hope, buried under centuries of tradition. Her heart longed for a day when she could explore new ideas and break free from the confines of duty. Fate took an unexpected turn when Captain Drake landed on Atravan during a peaceful diplomatic mission. He had heard of the kingdom and its storied court, a place where laws were as old as the stars. With humility and determination, Drake stepped onto Atravan's soft, unfamiliar soil. The moment felt charged with possibility, a meeting of two very different worlds. As Drake explored the bustling streets and ancient halls of Atravan, the seeds of change began to stir. In the quiet corners of the palace, Princess Larissa listened with hope as stories of freedom and distant lands reached her ears. Unbeknownst to both, their lives were about to intertwine in a way that would challenge the old order and open the door to a new future. Thus, under the watchful eyes of the cosmos, the journey of Captain Drake and Princess Larissa began, a journey that promised to shake the very foundations of Atravan and light the spark of change in a rigid world. Inside the grand palace of Atravan, the old ways ruled every day. The palace was a vast building with high ceilings, polished floors, and walls decorated with old tapestries. Each tapestry told a story of the kingdom's long history. Every inch of the palace reminded the people of a time when traditions were the only law. King Zorvan sat on a large, raised throne in the middle of the great hall. His face was stern and his eyes sharp, showing his firm belief in the old rules. The king was a strong leader, and he thought that following ancient customs was the only way to keep peace and order. All the people in the court looked to him for guidance, trusting that his wisdom would protect their way of life. Every day, court members gathered in the hall. Nobles in fine clothes, wise advisors, and loyal servants all took their places in strict order. They spoke in soft, measured tones, and every word was chosen with care. The rules of the court were written down long ago and had never changed. New ideas were rare, and anyone who questioned the old ways was quickly silenced by fear or ridicule. Princess Larissa, the king's only daughter, walked these same halls. Unlike the other members of the court, she did not feel at home with the ancient customs. Though she was raised in luxury and respect, a deep longing for freedom grew in her heart every day. Larissa often spent her free moments near a large window, gazing out at the endless sky. She imagined a life where she could make her own choices and see the stars up close, not just from behind cold stone walls. The princess felt trapped by the weight of centuries-old traditions. Every decision she made was watched by the court, and every action was a reminder of the strict rules she was expected to obey. Deep down, she wished for a change, a new way of life where tradition would not stand in the way of growth and hope. Captain Elias Drake, a visitor from another world, had come to Atravan on a peaceful mission. As he walked through the palace halls, he saw the beauty in the old traditions, but also felt the heavy chains they imposed on the people. Drake noticed the quiet pain in Princess Larissa's eyes when she passed by. He realized that while the court celebrated its past, it ignored the promise of a better future. Drake's heart filled with a strong desire to help those who were bound by these old rules. He believed that even in a place filled with history and rigid customs, the human spirit could spark change. The simple truth of freedom and progress was something he carried with him from his own world. In his mind, the strength of tradition could be softened by hope and courage. Thus, the Palace of Atravan became a silent battleground. On one side stood the old traditions, firmly held by King Zorvan and his loyal followers. On the other side, the seed of change had just been planted in the heart of Princess Larissa, and in the determined eyes of Captain Drake. In the quiet corridors of the palace, the soft hum of distant voices and footsteps created a calm that contrasted with the busy court. Captain Elias Drake walked slowly along the stone pathway, his eyes taking in every detail of Atravan's ancient architecture. The cool marble under his feet and the gentle glow of torches on the walls gave the corridor a magical feel. Tonight, as the palace prepared for another grand diplomatic event, Drake found himself wandering away from the crowd, seeking a moment of peace in the midst of the rigid traditions. At the far end of the corridor, near a tall window that opened to a sky filled with countless twinkling stars, stood Princess Larissa. She was alone, lost in thought, watching the night as if it held all the answers to her silent questions. The cool night air brushed her face, and for a moment, the heavy weight of tradition felt lighter. Her heart yearned for freedom, a life not defined by ancient rules and strict expectations. Captain Drake noticed her quiet presence and felt an immediate pull to speak. He approached slowly, careful not to disturb the peaceful moment. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice echoing gently in the quiet space. Startled by the sound, Princess Larissa turned. In his eyes, she saw warmth and a hint of determination, qualities she rarely encountered within these stony walls. "Good evening," she replied in a soft tone, curiosity shining in her eyes. They stood together by the window, sharing the silence for a few moments before the conversation began. Drake spoke first. He told her about his journeys across many worlds, about vast landscapes and people who lived free lives. He described the beauty of different cultures and the hope that change could bring. His words were simple, yet they carried the promise of a brighter future. Larissa listened carefully, each story making her feel as if a new door had opened inside her heart. The princess then shared her own dreams. "I often wonder what lies beyond these walls," she confessed. "I long to explore the world and to be free to make my own choices. I feel trapped by rules that do not let my spirit soar." Her voice was soft, filled with both sadness and hope. Drake nodded in understanding. "Every place deserves a chance to grow and change," he said. "Sometimes, even a small spark can start a great fire of hope." As they continued to talk, their bond grew stronger. In that quiet corridor, with the stars watching over them, they found common ground in their desire for a better life. It was as if the universe had brought them together at that very moment. Their conversation moved from dreams and distant worlds to plans for a future where freedom was more than just a word. They both knew that the road ahead would be hard, and that change would not come easily. But in that moment, they felt brave enough to imagine a new way of living. With the night wrapping around them like a gentle cloak, Captain Drake and Princess Larissa made an unspoken promise. They would work together to challenge the old ways, to light the spark of freedom that had been hidden for so long. Their fateful encounter marked the beginning of a journey that would soon shake the very foundations of Atraven. Captain Elias Drake spent many sleepless nights planning a daring rescue. The thought of freeing Princess Larissa from her gilded cage filled him with both hope and determination. He knew that the strict rules of Atraven would never allow her to live the life she dreamed of. With a few trusted friends, Drake formed a secret plan to take the princess away during the busy royal event, when the palace guards might be less alert. Late one night, under a dark and starry sky, Drake and his small band of allies moved quietly through the palace corridors. Every step was taken with care, as the silence of the night was broken only by their soft whispers and the distant echo of their footsteps. They gathered near a hidden door that led to a service corridor, one that had long been forgotten by those in power. This secret passage was their only hope to bypass the heavily guarded main hall. Inside the princess's private chamber, Princess Larissa sat by a window, lost in dreams of freedom. Suddenly, a gentle knock broke her solitude. When she opened the door, she found Drake standing there, his eyes kind yet filled with resolve. "Princess, I have come to help you," he said in a calm voice. For a moment, fear flashed in her eyes, but it quickly turned to a glimmer of hope. Here was a chance to escape the endless rules and heavy traditions that had chained her spirit for so long. Drake explained his plan simply. He told her that tonight, during the grand event in the main hall, they would slip away unnoticed. With each word, the princess's heart began to beat faster, not just with fear of the unknown, but with the excitement of a life without constraints. The princess hesitated for only a moment before nodding her consent. She understood that this bold act was the only way to break free. Hand in hand, they moved quickly through the dark corridors, guided by the light of hidden torches. Every turn and every step was filled with the risk of discovery. Yet the cool night air and the sound of distant celebrations in the palace gave them courage. Drake led the princess to a narrow staircase that led down to a secret exit. Outside, the open sky and the whisper of the wind seemed to promise a new beginning. As they left behind the palace and its strict traditions, a powerful feeling of liberation filled their hearts. The princess, once confined to a life of duty and silence, now stepped into the unknown with determination. Captain Drake and his allies melted into the darkness, their escape marking the first act of defiance against an age-old system. In that bold moment, the spark of change was lit, a spark that would soon grow into a blazing fire of hope and freedom for all of Atraven. The grand hall of Atraven's palace was filled with laughter and music. The royal event was at its peak, with nobles, ministers, and high-ranking officials enjoying the celebration. King Zorvan sat on his throne, watching the festivities with pride. He believed his kingdom was secure, its traditions unshaken. But everything changed when a breathless guard ran into the hall, his face pale with fear. "Your Majesty." The guard gasped. "Princess Larissa. She is gone." A heavy silence fell over the court. The music stopped. The nobles exchanged shocked glances. King Zorvan stood up, his eyes burning with anger. "What do you mean, gone?" he thundered. "The princess was taken, my lord," the guard stammered. "The human, Captain Elias Drake. He helped her escape." The words struck the king like a blade. The idea that a mere human had dared to defy Atraven's traditions, to take his daughter from the palace, was beyond belief. Zorvan clenched his fists, his rage shaking the air around him. "Find them," he roared, his voice echoing through the hall. The court erupted into chaos. Guards rushed to search every corridor, every hidden passage. Riders were sent to the city gates to stop anyone from leaving. The king's advisors whispered among themselves, their faces filled with worry. They knew that if word spread of the princess's escape, it could shake the kingdom's foundation. But deep down, Zorvan knew the truth. Larissa had chosen to leave. For years, he had sensed her growing restlessness, the longing in her eyes whenever she looked at the stars. She had always questioned the traditions that ruled their world. And now, with the help of a reckless, foolish human, she had broken free. The king paced the hall, his mind racing. If he declared the princess a traitor, the people might revolt. She was beloved by many, and her disappearance could inspire others to question the old ways. But if he did nothing, he would appear weak. One of his closest advisors, an elder named Varrock, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said in a grave tone, "we must act carefully. If we handle this the wrong way, the people will see the princess as a symbol of rebellion." Zorvan took a deep breath, his fury slowly turning into cold calculation. He could not let a human undermine his rule. "Find them," he ordered, his voice low but sharp. "Bring them back alive. The human will face the full force of Atrivan's justice." The hunt had begun. Meanwhile, far from the palace, Princess Larissa and Captain Drake moved through the darkened streets, unaware of the storm they had unleashed. They had escaped the palace, but they were not safe yet. The weight of their decision had set events in motion that neither of them could stop. For the first time in her life, Larissa was truly free, but at what cost? Princess Larissa and Captain Elias Drake moved swiftly through the quiet streets of Atrivan, their footsteps light against the stone roads. The palace was far behind them now, but the weight of their actions still pressed heavily on their shoulders. Larissa's heart pounded in her chest. For the first time in her life, she was free. Free from the traditions that had kept her locked away. Free to choose her own path. Yet, deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Drake led her toward the city's outskirts, where a small group of trusted allies waited. A hidden ship was ready to take them beyond the reach of Atrivan's laws. But before they could reach safety, a deep horn echoed through the night, the sound of the king's men calling for the city to awaken. "They know," Larissa whispered. Drake's jaw tightened. He had expected the king's response to be swift, but this was faster than he had hoped. The streets ahead lit up as guards patrolled every corner. There was no way out, not without a fight. "We don't have time," Drake said. "We need another way." Larissa, breathing hard, looked toward the towering palace in the distance. "No," she said, determination filling her voice. "We cannot run forever. We need to face this." Drake looked at her in surprise. "Face what?" "The court," she said. "The law. If we run, my father will make me an enemy. But if we stand before the court, if we challenge the traditions openly, we might have a chance." Drake hesitated. The plan had been to escape, to take Larissa far away from her father's reach. But now he saw something in her eyes: courage, strength, and the fire of someone ready to change the world. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. She nodded. "I must do this. For my people. For myself." With no other option, Drake agreed. And so, instead of running, they turned back toward the palace. By the time they reached the royal court, the great hall was filled with nobles, advisors, and warriors. King Zorvan sat upon his throne, his face dark with anger. The moment he saw his daughter enter the hall, he rose to his feet. "You dare return," he growled, "after betraying your own blood." Larissa stepped forward, standing tall despite the tension in the room. "I have not betrayed you, father," she said firmly. "I have only claimed the freedom that every living being deserves." Gasps filled the room. No one had ever spoken to the king this way before. Drake stepped beside her. "King Zorvan, your laws keep your daughter a prisoner. They keep your people in chains. Is that truly the legacy you wish to leave behind?" The king's eyes burned with fury, but for the first time, doubt flickered within them. The trial had begun. The fate of Atrivan, and the future of its people, rested on what would happen next. The royal court of Atrivan was silent. The weight of Princess Larissa's words hung in the air like a storm cloud about to break. King Zorvan sat rigid on his throne, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. His daughter had returned, not as a prisoner, not as a runaway, but as a challenger to the very traditions he had spent his life upholding. The nobles and ministers whispered among themselves, uncertain of what to think. Some looked at the princess with admiration, others with fear. Never before had anyone dared to question the old ways in front of the court, and certainly not the king's own daughter. King Zorvan's voice cut through the murmurs. "You speak of freedom, but do you understand what you ask for?" His tone was sharp, but beneath it, there was something else. Hesitation. For centuries, Atrevan has followed the laws of our ancestors. These laws have kept our people strong. And now you wish to throw them away because of the foolish words of a human. His eyes locked onto Captain Ilias Drake, his anger barely contained. Drake held his ground. "Your Majesty, tradition should serve the people, not trap them. If a law only brings suffering, should it not be changed?" A ripple of unease spread through the court. Many of the younger nobles nodded in quiet agreement. The old ways had been followed for so long that no one had ever dared to ask if they were still right. Princess Larissa stepped forward, her voice steady. "Father, I love my people. I love our home. But we cannot close ourselves off from the rest of the universe. We cannot pretend that change will not come. I do not ask you to abandon our culture. I ask you to let it grow." The king's eyes flashed with emotion. His daughter's words struck deep, shaking the certainty that had guided him for decades. For years, he had ruled with an iron will, believing that strength came from unbreakable laws. But now, for the first time, he saw something else: hope. Before he could speak, one of his most trusted advisors, Lord Varrock, stepped forward. He was an elder, a man who had served Atrevan longer than many in the court had been alive. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "perhaps the princess is right. Perhaps it is time to listen, not only to our ancestors but to the future as well." More whispers spread. Some nobles looked shocked, others thoughtful. The court, once unshakable, was beginning to waver. King Zorvan looked around at the faces of his people, then back at his daughter. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had once carried in his youth. With a heavy sigh, he sat back in his throne. "This is not how I imagined my reign would be tested," he said at last. "But if change is truly upon us, then we will face it together." A stunned silence filled the hall. Then, one by one, the nobles bowed their heads in agreement. The old order had begun to crumble, and a new future for Atrevan had just begun. The great hall of Atrevan was no longer silent. The air buzzed with tension as nobles, advisors, and warriors whispered among themselves. The unshakable traditions of the kingdom had been challenged, and the very man who had enforced them, King Zorvan, was hesitating. Princess Larissa stood tall, her heart pounding. For the first time in her life, she had spoken freely, without fear of punishment. She had challenged the system that had kept her a prisoner in her own home. And now, the people were listening. Captain Ilias Drake watched the court closely. He knew that change never came easily. There were those who still believed in the old ways, those who feared what freedom might bring. But there was something else in the air, something powerful. A spark had been lit, and it was spreading. King Zorvan finally spoke. His voice, though calmer than before, still carried the weight of his authority. "Change is not something to take lightly," he said, his gaze moving over the gathered nobles. "For generations, our people have followed the traditions set by our ancestors. But tell me, my court, has tradition made us stronger, or has it made us blind?" The question hung in the air. No one dared to speak at first. Then, slowly, a voice rose from the crowd. "It has made us blind." An older noble admitted, "We have closed ourselves off from the rest of the universe for too long." Another voice followed. "We cannot ignore the world outside, Your Majesty. The princess is right." More murmurs of agreement filled the hall. Others still looked uncertain, but doubt had already begun to crack the foundation of the old ways. Larissa stepped forward. "I do not wish to destroy our past," she said. "I only wish for a future where we are free to choose, where we can decide our own destinies. Is that not the right of every living being?" The court was divided. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, their expressions unreadable. Then, to everyone's surprise, A group of palace guards entered the hall. They bowed before the king. "Your Majesty," one of them said, "we have served you with loyalty, and we will continue to do so. But we, too, believe that our people deserve the right to choose their own path." The moment was electric. Even the palace guards, the enforcers of Atrevan's strict laws, were questioning the system. Drake stepped beside Larissa, his voice firm. "This is not just about a princess or a king. This is about all of you. What kind of future do you want for your children? One ruled by fear of change, or one where they are free to dream?" The court was silent again, but this time, the silence was different. It was the silence of a people realizing they stood at the edge of something new, something greater than fear. And then, one by one, heads began to nod. The rallying cry for freedom had begun. The court of Atrevan stood on the edge of change. The old ways, once considered unbreakable, now trembled under the weight of truth. Princess Larissa had spoken. Captain Elias Drake had challenged, and even the king's own guards had voiced their support. But one question still remained. What would King Zorvan decide? The king sat on his throne, his fingers gripping the armrests as he looked at the faces before him. He had spent his life ruling with firm laws, believing that order and tradition were the pillars of strength. Yet now, for the first time, he wondered, had he truly been protecting his people, or had he been holding them back? Larissa took a deep breath and stepped closer. Her voice was strong, yet filled with emotion. "Father," she said, "I love this kingdom as much as you do. But love is not chains. Love is not fear. You have always ruled with strength. But true strength is not in forcing obedience. It is in giving people the power to choose their own fate." The court listened in silence. Some still looked hesitant, clinging to the past. But others, many others, nodded in agreement. Drake spoke next. "Your Majesty, humanity has made many mistakes, but one thing we have learned is that change is not the enemy. It is the key to survival. You have the power to guide your people into a new era, one where they are not prisoners of tradition, but builders of their own destiny." King Zorvan closed his eyes for a long moment. He could still hear the voices of his ancestors, whispering of duty and law. But then, another voice rang in his mind. His daughters, filled with hope and courage. When he opened his eyes, the fire of a warrior king burned within them. He stood, and the entire hall fell silent. "The old ways have kept us safe for generations," he said, "but safety is not the same as progress." He turned his gaze toward Larissa. "My daughter, you have shown me that strength is not in holding on to the past, but in embracing the future." Casts filled the hall. Nobles looked at one another in shock. The king, who had been the strongest defender of tradition, was now speaking of change. King Zorvan raised his voice. "The laws of Atrevan will not be destroyed, but they will be rewritten. Our people will no longer be forced into roles they did not choose. We will no longer fear the outside world. We will learn from it, grow from it." Then he turned to Drake. "And humanity will not be our enemy. It will be our ally." The court erupted. Some still clung to their fears, but many more cheered. The impossible had happened. Atrevan had taken its first step into a new age. Larissa's eyes filled with tears, but they were not of sorrow. They were of hope. The world she had dreamed of was no longer just a dream. It was real. The court of Atrevan was forever changed. The voices of the people filled the great hall, not with fear or anger, but with something new, hope. Princess Larissa stood tall beside Captain Elias Drake, watching as the walls of tradition crumbled, and a new path was born. The old ways had not been erased, but they had been reshaped into something better, something fairer. King Zorvan looked over his court, his face solemn yet strong. He had ruled for decades with strict laws, believing them to be the only way to maintain peace. But now he saw the truth. Peace was not found in control. It was found in trust, in the freedom to choose. Stepping forward, he addressed his people. "Today, Atrevan does not fall. It rises. His voice was steady, filled with the weight of a decision that would shake generations. We will no longer be a kingdom that fears change. We will be a kingdom that embraces it. A cheer rose from the nobles and warriors who had once lived under the shadows of rigid tradition. Even those who had hesitated could see that this was the only path forward. The princess, their future queen, had shown them that the world was not meant to be locked away, but explored with open hearts. Larissa turned to Drake, her eyes shining. "You did not just help me escape a cage. You helped my people escape one too." Drake smiled. "You were always meant to fly free, princess. You just needed a little push." The king watched them, his gaze lingering on Drake. "Human, you have done what no one else dared. You challenged me. You challenged an entire world. And you were right." He let out a deep sigh before continuing. "Atraven owes you a great debt. And perhaps, one day, we will return the favor." Drake gave a respectful nod. "If humanity has learned one thing, it is that strength is not in standing alone, but in standing together." The following days were filled with change. The royal court set forth new laws, ones that allowed the people to have a voice in their own future. No longer would the princess be forced into a life she did not choose. No longer would Atraven's people be bound by the fear of the unknown. As the first rays of dawn broke over the palace, Larissa stood on the highest balcony, looking toward the stars. She had dreamt of this moment her whole life. And now, it was real. Drake stood beside her. "What now, princess?" She turned to him, a smile playing on her lips. "Now we build a future where no one has to fight for their freedom." The wind carried their words into the open sky, where a new era had begun. And for the first time in Atraven's long history, the world stood on the edge of something greater than tradition, possibility.